Good morning, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Reopen Ohio, Employment Law, Reopening Readiness, Risks and Responses, brought to you by the President's Council in partnership with McDonald Hopkins. My name is Erica Pinnock, and I am the Executive Director of the President's Council. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the President's Council website. The slides our panelists are using today are also available for download in the Handouts tab on the GoToWebinar control panel. We also encourage and welcome the opportunity to connect via phone, email, and web chat. Before we get started, please note your video should be automatically turned off and devices muted. If not, please do so at this time. As you have questions or comments, please insert it in the chat thread and we will address questions from the audience at the conclusion of our presentation. If you submitted questions in advance of the program today, we will try to cover those questions during our discussion. Today's expert presenters are Teresa Metcalf Beasley, member and chair of McDonald Hopkins Public Law Group; Miriam L. Rosen, member and chair of McDonald Hopkins and Employment Practice Group; Ryan Neumeyer, member of McDonald Hopkins Labor and Employment Practice Group. Teresa, Miriam, and Ryan, thank you so much for hosting and joining us this morning. As we reopen our doors to a new normal of doing business, what should we know and do to protect both our employees and our businesses?
Thank you, Erica, for the opportunity to present today and join your membership and others in today's discussion. And if we would move forward, thank you. Obviously, this is, and first and foremost, we're dealing with this is the health crisis we're dealing with, but it has also turned out to be an employment crisis. As we have talked to so many business owners in the last 3 months, we see them trying to make the best decisions for the health and safety of their employees and the financial viability of their companies. Business owners have had to make decisions with uncertain scientific information and facts, and government orders that seem to change regularly, and several new employment laws to contend with. To say the least, it's been challenging for employers. And now as businesses are getting back to the physical workplace, employers will need to meet the challenges and risk of a changed workplace. Every business has its own particular set of issues and concerns. And as we put together our material for today, our goal is to cover several broad themes that will be applicable to many employers and to provide you with a framework for considering the many issues that you will continue to encounter. Next slide, please. During today's discussion, we will examine practical health and safety considerations for reopening physical workplaces. We will discuss employee concerns and issues under the FFCRA and FMLA. We will also review challenges and risks related to returning employees from furloughs, layoffs, and unemployment benefits. We'll talk through policy issues facing employers. And finally, we will consider the changed nature of the workplace and unanticipated employment law risk in returning to the workplace. And Ryan, I will turn it over to you to get us started, please.
Thank you. Sorry, I was on mute, but thank you, Teresa, and thanks for President's Council for having us today. I think many of us know now that these issues are very important and that we need to have a plan put together to reopen business or even to reopen public places of employment. Without further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about the source of the guidance. And there doesn't seem to be there's a lot out there on these topics. So I think the challenge now is kind of wading through the information or not getting overloaded. So I think a great place to look is of course the CDC. I think we've used a lot of their materials and their guidance in relation to a lot of these issues with COVID-19. OSHA, of course, has various materials out. There is a special guidance to meat packers who've had a lot of issues with COVID-19 due to the nature of their work and that they have to work closely together. But I would say to you that guidance, even though it's related to meat packers, isn't a bad place to start, depending upon what your business is. Certainly, if you have physical activity, it's not a bad place to look for ideas. Then we also have the Ohio Department of Health or other states. I think we're basically Ohio-centric here, but other states have guidance as well. One that I've used or taken a look, Cleveland Clinic had some nice guidance put out. So hospitals, also Johns Hopkins has done, I think, a good job with some of its materials, something to take a look at as well. And then if you're involved with any kind of trade association or, the municipalities can look to their different associations for guidance. They have some nice materials out there. And a lot of the trade associations have forums in which you're trading information. So I encourage you, to check those out if you have access to those materials, to kind of see what others are doing, and try to take the best and tailor it to your business. And so that goes to the next step here of assessing the workplace. So we're going to need to develop protocols for safety and health checks, building receptions, shipping, receiving, elevators, visitors policy. You're going to want to prepare the building, cleaning plans, pre-return, HVAC and mechanical. So really it's kind of, again, tailoring these different checklists and plans that you have for different issues that you might not have thought of, tailoring it to your workplace. And to do that, you need to assess your physical workplace to make sure that you're putting all of these in place in a way that works for your business. So that's something, and really a lot of this when we're developing these policies and protocols, that's what it is. It's thinking about it. It's kind of making your brain sweat and, diving in, looking at all the issues, because your business or your city and how people work better than outsiders. You can get assistance and you can get help from outside counsel. We're certainly here to help you, but ultimately you're going to know the details intimately of your workplace. So you're going to be in best position to kind of put the procedures in place. And we'll talk about some of the things that you kind of have to have in place throughout this presentation. But there's also things that'll come up that are unique to your workplace. Preparedness and controls, review the guidance. Review the guidance that I had mentioned, anticipate issues again, assess your workplace. One thing, if you're in a multi-unit, a multi-tenant unit, you're in an office building with this type of issue with the pandemic, we're going to want to coordinate, because if your suite mates aren't taking proper protections, that can affect your workforce, and it's going to end up being, your issue. And also, if you're not taking proper precautions and something happens, potentially, it could be an issue for you. So definitely, and we'll talk a little bit about liability later, but that's an issue, and really kind of taking these steps somewhat mitigate that liability. So also, explore the possibility of staggering work hours, because this is a disease or a virus that's passed, through closeness. Reconfigure workplaces. So look at your office plan or your place of work. Make sure that you're taking proper precautions so that everybody's workplace is separated. To basically to respond to the social distancing, the 6 feet. Consider marking quadrants on the floor of open areas such as labs or manufacturing facilities, so there is only one employee per section at a time. I've had a lot of workplaces do that. You want to think about the flow. Do you have a direction in your office or your workplace that you want people to flow so they don't run into each other? Elevator issues, how many people in an elevator? Think about, staggering times so that you don't have congestion of people trying to get into work. Are you going to take temperatures? Require employees to at least tell you whether or not they have symptoms before they come to work. I've designed a sheet called a self-declaration, so employees can. Sorry, can you go back, please? Thank you. So the plans for staffing, make sure you're flexible, ensure compliance with the applicable regulations, and prepare for inevitable staffing shortages that might be caused by childcare. Those are all things we need to think about. The PPE, make sure that you're analyzing your workplace and that you have proper PPE. The face covering has always been an issue, so make sure you're giving your employees guidance on face covering in Ohio. It's necessary unless there's hazards, so you need to make an analysis of your workplace to determine whether or not there's hazards. Make sure you're training your workers on all of these these practices, good hygiene. I mean, believe it or not, good cough and sneeze etiquette. Avoid, touching your eyes. I know they tell you to put a mask on and then avoid touching your, I count each day how many times I touch my face, and it's like, oh my gosh. Avoid close contact with people who are sick, of course. So these are all things that we're going to need to, kind of, even though they might seem, kind of obvious to us, we want to repeat them again and again, and make sure that our employees are trained properly. And if you have OSHA or PERP trainings that you need to do, think bloodborne pathogens, or people need to wear a respirator, you might want to think about redoing those, even if you've already done them. And then finally, health screenings, so taking temperatures, that type of thing. And then best practices, look to OSHA, look to the Department of Health, and try to go above and beyond if you can. Next slide. Okay, so here, real quick, and we've probably gone through these, a little bit already, but here's things to think about with social distancing: is limiting interactions. So move all of part of your business online if you can. It's something to think about. Enable employees to work from home where possible. Establish virtual service options. Restrict number of customers and clients. So if you need to make sure, if you're a retail or you need customers or clients to come into your office, you limit the number. I believe in Ohio it's half the occupancy at the most. So we got to study those orders too still, and if they're recommendations, I would recommend following them, because I think that's going to be helpful if there is an outbreak, that you did follow those best recommendations. So if a third party gets sick and they try to blame you for it through the law, through legal process, that would be a defense. Changing arrival and processing procedures. So, how employees go in and out, making sure that there's proper rotation so that we don't, again, have a log jam. You can think about changing your operating hours, those types of things. So the next one says social distancing measures, limiting close contact. Use your digital, even if you're at the office. If you're going to have a meeting, perhaps have it on Zoom, have a telephone call. If you need to have it in person, make sure you have a room big enough to socially distance. Limit, attendance at meetings. You could use your parking lot if possible. I mean, that's kind of tough, especially if you're in a multi-unit office, or you're an industrial park with other tenants. But if you can, you might want to think about having those outside. Masks really should be wear, face coverings. We talked about floor markings. So when you are, you don't have to wear a mask when you're sitting alone at your desk, but when you get up to move around and you're going to be actually coming in contact with folks, then we definitely want to wear a mask or face coverings, and we want to train our employees. So limiting gatherings, that's the new normal. Again, learn to communicate with methods and limit in-person meetings, and I think we've become good at that. Pre-meeting seating assignments, so, when people get there, they know where they're going if you are doing an in-person meeting. And then also, if you need to have a lot of in-person, you're going to want to maybe think about providing some barriers. Next slide, thanks. So we kind of went through the OSHA standards here, and this is kind of a process or steps. So the plan is, consider how, and this is kind of repeating myself a little bit, but consider how workers may be exposed to COVID-19, non-occupational risk factors, and workers' individual risks. Have cleaning activities throughout the workday. So a lot of employers, you might want to designate somebody to clean your touch points. Develop and implement sanitation. We're going to be doing that after hours. One of the things you can think about as well is maybe, your cleaning staff vacuumed every day. Maybe we have less vacuuming and more wiping down after hours, more deep cleaning of surfaces and touch points, so more time spent there rather than vacuuming. And you're going to want to identify one person who's responsible for these things, make sure that they're trained and they understand what needs to be done in terms of cleaning and disinfecting for COVID-19. We're going to want to train, and this goes to the process, we're going to want to train employees on infection prevention and control procedures. We're going to want to, in construction, you do toolbox talks. We don't want everyone together, but you want to give some sort of simple training method, maybe a PowerPoint, a simple PowerPoint. There's lots of materials from ODH. There's lots of materials from CDC. Those simple little pictographs that have been coming out. Make sure that those go out. I mean, maybe even each day you could send an email with some training. So that's something that we can do. You want to make sure you get buy-in. I think it's really important to create signage. Also, the practices provide a means by which individuals can sanitize objects or surfaces when interacting with them. So like if you got a printer, you want to have hand sanitizer there, and you want to be able to wipe that down. Provide equipment to limit direct contact with high-touch surfaces, gloves, single-use tools. There's little hooks and different things that you can use for doors. You might want to think about providing those. And again, I think really it's important to provide cleaners. You might even want to enlist employees' assistance. Consider having an employee dedicated to ensuring sanitation of certain areas, but make sure they're provided proper training. Next slide. This also has to do with OSHA. It's reporting issues. So make sure if your business or if you're a government entity, it would be under PERP. You would have to report potentially a COVID-19 illness, and they've kind of changed this around. So they weren't requiring reporting under certain circumstances, which now you have to do an analysis. So if you get a confirmed case of COVID-19, you want to do an analysis as to whether or not it was work-related. That's something that you want to be cognizant of, and employers must take reasonable efforts to determine whether the exposure is work-related. So you want to ask the employee limited questions about how COVID-19 was contracted, where they were, did they go to a large group prior to, or could it have happened at work? Who were they talking to? Who are they working with? Are those people sick? Did they have symptoms at work? And then investigating the work environment, looking at touch points, places that person may have gone to determine whether or not it needs to be reported as a work-related incident. So just something to be cognizant of. And not all employers have OSHA 300 reporting requirements. So, construction and manufacturing. So make sure you know whether or not you should probably know whether or not you have OSHA 300 requirements. If not, call counsel or your safety. If you have a safety person, I'm sure you probably know whether or not you need an OSHA 300 log, but make sure you look up your type of business and determine whether or not you need to report under OSHA 300 in general. So next slide. So here's some areas where we have risk. Of course, workers' comp, and that's going to come down to whether or not this, catching COVID-19, if someone should happen to get it, happened at work, whether or not it was work-related. Obviously, first responders and folks working in hospitals, it's a little bit more direct. You move away from that when you're dealing with construction, manufacturing, office, and other places of employment. Retail now, and salons, hairdressers, people like that, workers there. There'll be these arguments that they contracted at work so they can get benefits. So we'll probably be dealing with that for a while as people are contracting once the opening becomes more widespread, and we're dealing with those types of issues. Employer intentional torts, that's a tort which basically says that it was substantially certain to happen. And again, to combat or mitigate against all of this type of liability, all the things I just talked about, and all of those policies are so important to put into place. And so, to defend against any of these actions that are up here on the screen right now, we're going to need to show that the employer didn't, shirk its duties, and it was doing everything that it could to keep the place clean and free of COVID-19. Is that even possible? Probably not, but we got to take these measures to show that we're not, shirking our responsibilities, and we're doing what a reasonable employer would do under similar circumstances. In the cases that I've seen, I know there's been one filed against Walmart, the meatpacking industry, Smithfield. All of these cases, the common elements are the employers aren't doing what is necessary under state and federal guidelines to keep the workplace safe. And that will tie into your OSHA issues, OSHA violations. If you're not doing these things, employees, and I've had it happen already, they will complain. So it's so important that you look at your workplace and you put these measures in place, not only for workers, but also third-party lawsuits, which are actually probably more of a concern that a third party comes in and files a lawsuit because they got sick and we weren't doing what was proper in terms of keeping our workplace clean and hygienic as per the guidelines. So with that, I think
Ryan,
the next,
before we,
yeah.
This is Teresa. Before we transition, what should an employer do, or what are the rights of the employer should the employee not comply with the guidelines the employer has put in place?
And That's a great question, and you know, it's something that we've dealt with, and I think you need to apply your typical discipline policy, just as you know, with different workplaces where we have safety programs, and you're going to be more familiar with those in construction and manufacturing and where you're doing physical labor. But when folks don't comply with safety requirements, you know, you put them on a progressive discipline. And there's some things that they may do that are so outside the bounds of what's reasonable, you know, it may lead to termination, certainly in an at-will environment. So it's something that we need to train our managers to recognize, well, what are the standards so that they can train the employees. And we need to probably have, you know, policies in place and education materials so we can demonstrate that we taught the employees what to do and that they didn't do it, and therefore, you know, we discipline them just like any other type of performance or behavioral management.
Thank you.
So that's actually, this is Miriam Rosen, so that's actually the perfect segue to the next section, which is really when where we're talking about employee issues. Couldn't have set it up better, Teresa, thank you. So let's say you've taken all of these great steps that Ryan has talked about. Your physical workplace is ready, but let's face it, you know, as business owners and employers, that you still have a big wild card, and that's your employees. And you know, Teresa's question was perfect because it really goes to what if employees are not complying with these things. And what we have seen already, just as employers are starting to come back to work, is that employees still are very anxious and have a heightened level of concern about returning to the workplace. And some of that Ryan's already mentioned, that we've seen refusal to come back to work. We've seen increased requests for leave and, frankly, increased complaints. And in some ways, complaints that we don't often usually see. So these aren't necessarily complaints that are with the EEOC or related to leaves, but they're complaints related to safety issues. So one of the things that we have been recommending for employers is to really, as you're preparing your procedures and protocols, is also to think about employee situations that you're going to encounter. Best practice is to work through a variety of scenarios. Why is that? Well, number one, you're going to be prepared, and number two, you'll be consistent. So if an employee says, you treated me differently because I wouldn't wear a mask, well, you can say, no, here's our protocol, and we have been consistent. So you see a couple of the common scenarios on the side. These are things you likely have already dealt with. You know, an employee who's got a fever, what do you do? An employee who needs to take care of a family member. We'll talk about the Families First Coronavirus Response Act that Teresa mentioned in the opening in the next slide, but and employees who are in close contact and the need to potentially keep them self-isolated. But there are some other scenarios I want you to think through. And these are, you know, as you're thinking through the process of how your workplace now works. So we mentioned you should be doing a health screen. So what happens, oh, thank you. So what happens when your employee doesn't want to have their temperature taken or answer very basic questions about, you know, whether they have any of the COVID symptoms. And I've already seen that happen with employers. And, you know, I've had employees who've said it's their constitutional right not to have their temperature taken. Not sure that's in the Constitution, but, you know, you still have to be prepared to respond, and you have to decide how insistent you're going to be. And so I think you've got a little sense from, you know, the way Ryan answered the question of, first of all, now these types of screens are really standard safety requirements. Why are we doing this? Because we want to keep the workplace safe. So if you think of it in that context, that kind of helps you get to what your response would be. With any safety requirement, you might say, okay, why can't you follow this requirement? Is there a legitimate reason? Maybe there's an underlying medical reason that someone can't wear a mask or have their temperature taken. So then we would have to evaluate whether we can deal with that. But the next step is, if there isn't a legitimate reason, then we're going to enforce our safety requirement, and you're going to follow the process that you would normally follow if someone refuses to follow a safety requirement. Just to give you another example of a situation you should prepare for, is a complaint about safety practices. So if an employee comes to you and they have a concern about people not wiping down the copier or people not staying distance, please take that seriously. Again, I will tell you that we have already seen an increase in complaints to OSHA. And so it's important for employers to understand the process of taking the complaint seriously, looking at the situation, responding, and making sure that they have documented their response. I had a client who had a OSHA complaint, and they had a COVID situation. They had an outside cleaning crew come in, and I have to give them a ton of credit because they took pictures of the cleaning crew while they were there, documented the whole process of doing a deep clean. And when they when they got the OSHA complaint, they were then able to say, here are all the steps we took. And by the way, OSHA, here are some pictures of what we did. So think through those sorts of things. If you're responding to a complaint, how do you prove that you responded appropriately? Next slide, please. So one of the scenarios you're very likely to encounter is employees who can't or won't come back to work for a variety of reasons. And those may be that they have the coronavirus, or it may be that they have child care issues. So actually the first law that was passed related to this crisis was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. And you see that there, FFCRA. And we also have, the traditional laws that have been in existence for a long time, the Family Medical Leave Act and the ADA, which we'll talk about in a second. I just want to go over these because while it may feel like we're a little bit beyond the peak of the crisis, one thing that's, I think, important to remember and to make sure that your supervisors remember is the FFCRA is still in effect till the end of the year. It could even be extended. So we need to be thinking about that as employees tell us they can't come back to work. So our first level of examination is, do employees qualify for some time off? And this time under these two laws is paid. So we have to kind of do our first level of analysis. Does an employee qualify for some time off under the FFCRA? And then we might even need to go to the next level. Well, if it's not the FFCRA, is it a serious health condition? Or is it potentially a disability? And there's some other issues there. So I'm just you can look at these slides and obviously find lots of information. I'm just going to briefly tell you that the emergency paid sick leave is 80 hours of paid time. If it's the employee's own sickness, paid at full pay up to a cap, and for child care and family care, 2/3 of pay, again, up to a cap. Emergency Family Medical Leave Act is only for child care. That's paid at 2/3. First 2 weeks of that are not paid, but you can use this other paid sick leave for that. And then, of course, we still have the classic leave. So if an employee has a serious health condition, they may be eligible for time off for themselves or their family members. That is unpaid, although benefits might be available. Next slide, please. So I also talked about, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and employers are still obligated to comply with the ADA. So one of the things we've seen is employees saying they might not have the coronavirus, but they may say, I have this underlying condition and I can't come back to work because of that, because it makes me more susceptible, because there's a greater risk to me. And so when employers are telling you that, we can't just say, well, you're not sick now, so I don't need to think about that. You still have an obligation to evaluate whether the employee should be accommodated. And one thing we have seen, and I would just want to make you aware of it, is heightened issues related to mental health disabilities. So anxiety, PTSD, that are exacerbated by COVID concerns. Again, I have a client who had an employee who just was overwhelmed by fear and already had some anxiety issues. And we had to work through the accommodation process. So in a leave of absence, because of those, even though the employee did not have COVID, had not been exposed to COVID, she was just afraid. How do you do that? Well, your HR professionals will know that when you're providing an accommodation, that's the interactive process. So you gather information from the employee, and if you need it, from their healthcare provider to understand what their disability is and how you might accommodate that. Now, what the EOC has said is that given the circumstances, sometimes that can be an extended process. You may want to expedite that process and provide some temporary accommodations. And I would tell you that if you're providing accommodations that you think will be temporary, you want to make sure in your written communications that you make that clear it's temporary, because you don't want to have to continue something that you did just to address an immediate situation. And then I can't stress strongly enough how important it is to keep medical information confidential. We in this whole process, employers have become a lot more open about asking questions about employees' health conditions. But we have to remember that those rules about confidentiality continue to apply. And I'll just add, I think employers have been pretty good about this, about not understanding that you can't disclose who may be COVID positive. And so although it might be a little awkward to say, well, you've had an exposure, but we can't tell you who, that's what you have to do. Next slide, please. So a couple of, Ryan touched on this, I'm just going to go into a bit more detail, workplace screenings. You've got your employees back. How do you make sure that you're keeping the workplace safe? So temperature taking, the EOC would normally consider temperature taking a medical exam, and employers typically can't perform medical exams unless there's a business reason. But basically what the EOC has said here is, well, yes, there is a business reason. And it's an indication of whether employees have COVID-19, maybe having symptoms of COVID-19. So temperature taking, as you're deciding how to go about that process, remember confidentiality issues, remember privacy issues. I would tell you that I think we've also, the EOC has also said you can do screenings. And I would tell you in both of these processes, think through the best way to accomplish this that's right for your workforce. So some employers may be doing screenings, at the point of entry. Other employers may decide that it's appropriate to, they can let employees self-screen and provide feedback through an app, through text messaging. What I would tell you is look at the guidance in your state to make sure that you're following the requirements for screening, if there are requirements, and that then you develop a screen that gets at just the information you need, and you're also taking steps to maintain information that you gather confidentially. And I've had some employers say, well, I'm doing these daily screenings on a piece of paper. That's a lot of paper. How long do I have to maintain it? So also think about how you properly destroy that information. We've had some questions about testing and antibody testing, and employers, like other tests, right, to ensure that the workplace is safe. So you could think of a comparable, a drug screen maybe. Employers can test or can require tests at this point because it, again, is business related. Antibody testing a little less clear just because we still haven't hit the level where antibody testing, where it's certain that it's safe and reliable. And I think something we have to, that employers are going to need to watch for is contact tracing and how that develops. Next slide, please. So we have, again, Ryan mentioned we've seen some heightened claims. We've seen heightened claims already, or increased claims with regard to complaints to the Department of Labor about leave under the Families First Act, FMLA violations, and also accommodation issues. So I would just urge you that since we know these are touch points for employees who are anxious, really do a thorough job of vetting the requests and documenting your response. Next slide. So employers had to quickly respond to closings of their facilities, shutting down temporarily, and they've done it in a variety of ways, and kind of set these out here: reduced schedules, furloughs, layoffs. And so I think now, in the coming back process, it's almost an unwinding. And some of the expectations that were set kind of also feed into what employees expect when they come back to work. When we use the term furloughs, employees have understood that to mean that there's an expectation they'll return to work. Layoffs may be temporary or permanent, which provides a different expectation. Why is this important? Next slide, please. Because it's important because now employees, well, while they went out and everyone understood the need to be off work, employers are making some different decisions than they might have anticipated when they put people off. And this is where I think employers are vulnerable to potential claims, because employers may be saying, wait a second, I put employees on a furlough and I expected to bring everybody back. But now I see that I don't have the need. I want to make some changes in my business, or just don't need people, or I don't need some people. And so they want to change those furloughs to terminations. And I have seen that with a number of employers, and I think there's obviously heightened risk there, because now everyone's not being affected, but some people are coming back and some aren't. So I would really urge you to, if you're making those sorts of decisions, to document the business reasons for your decision. If you are treating employees in different ways, document and have a legitimate business reason that supports those decisions. Think through it. I know this is a hard time to be talking about a severance, but a severance, if you're providing some severance, what you will typically get in return for that is a release of any claims. So there may be some value in getting that release, even if you're paying a severance. And then, of course, provide a consistent message about your decision. Next slide. Okay, so you've figured out who you want to come back. Let me just talk briefly, because we still have some material to get through here, about some things you need to be doing. Ryan mentioned training. You're asking employees. We all know that we're creatures of habit, right? We all do things the same way. I could probably park my car and walk into my office building without thinking through any of those processes. But now we have to think differently. Employees have to think differently. So I would really encourage you to do some training. Doesn't have to be extensive training. I'll note that the CDC has a variety of short PowerPoints and posters and training materials. I've created for a number of clients just a short PowerPoint that goes over steps. But I think the most important thing is to make sure employees understand what's required. And as Ryan mentioned, that's a good defense. If an employee says, I didn't know, you can say, wait a second, you had training, you signed off on it, all of those things. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is really, and I'll put these two together, support services and communications. We know employees are feeling anxious. So make sure you are thinking about that you have a point of contact for them, and that if you have resources. So if you have an EAP, if you have other resources, make sure you're reminding them that those are available. And I would say just a paramount issue is communicate with employees. We know that in a vacuum, employees tend to kind of come up with issues that may or may not exist. So make sure you're having regular communications. I saw employers do such a great job communicating with employees about, let's say in the going out process. Well, we have to keep that up. Employers who have employees working remotely, who are having Zoom meetings, who are communicating with them on a weekly basis or even a daily basis. So maybe it doesn't have to be that same level, but you still want employees to know what you're doing. It also goes a long way to protecting yourself if you get some sort of complaint. So next slide, please. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to talk about probably one of the biggest issues that we have.
And Ryan, before you start, I'm sorry,
go ahead. Yeah,
but
sorry.
we have received some questions. So for our participants, we are going to go through the rest of the presentation, and we will stay on if we go past the noon time period, just to respond to the questions that we have not fully addressed. Thanks, Ryan.
No problem. I'll do my best. But to reiterate what Miriam said, and there's so much great information in there, but I think communication and that kind of leads into this next slide. And this is the question we've probably gotten the most, is that person who really doesn't have, they're not high risk, their doctor's not telling them to stay home, but they're afraid to come to work. And what do I do in this situation? And we've talked about, Miriam and I, and we agree kind of on the process is you really want to explain to that individual or group of individuals what health and safety measures you're taking. So again, going back to that communication and all these steps we've talked about today, that's why they're so important. You're going to want to show them, look, we're doing everything that the government and the ODH and Ms. Atkins telling us to do. And we believe that, we're taking all these actions so that we can operate, and we're operating as, I always hesitate to use the word safely, because there's no, absolute safe procedure here, but, operating in a manner that's consistent with all of the guidance. So then you want to let them know, what are their options really? And that's up to the employer. I say, to communicate, but also, be patient in this situation. People are scared, but as time goes on, more and more becomes known. So what I've told clients to do is kind of explain to the employee about their benefits, potential benefits, and why they're not applicable. The FFCRA benefits aren't applicable in this situation, why they shouldn't get unemployment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But, technically they should not be, unemployment should not be available in these situations. Whether it's the $600 payment that I'm sure everybody's heard of, or otherwise, because there's work available. So you would allow them to take this leave, but it would be unpaid, and then you would revisit, and you'd want to put a deadline on it. So, like I said, this situation is kind of, what was happening in March. We know a lot more today, and it looks like into July and June, or into the end of June and into July, we're going to have even more information. So I said I gave them a 2-week period, and a lot of times the employees came back after we explained those things to them. One thing to think about in these situations that a lot of employers that aren't union don't think about is if you have a group of employees that walk off because of health considerations, that could be protected concerted activity, whether you're union or non-union. So that's something that we've had to deal with, where employers, want to terminate for people walking off the job. You could be walking right into an unfair labor practice charge. Also, if somebody's complaining to OSHA, you want to, really be cognizant of OSHA retaliation. And then I've heard a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys talk about this claim called wrongful termination in violation of public policy for terminating individuals under these circumstances. So be very, very careful in these situations, and you probably want to communicate with your counsel if you're thinking about taking an adverse employment action. And I've recommended not doing so. Again, it's, explain to them what's going on, explain to them their benefits, and then revisit it within a number of days. Also, think about telework. Is that possible? Is there a disability? Then you might be required to provide leave. Potentially, there might be FMLA. So those are all good things to think about in these situations. Next slide. Okay, so dealing with unemployment benefits. So we have this problem, as I had mentioned, that especially when they're necessary, and then individuals would be getting the $600 benefit plus state unemployment, and many people, for instance, my mother-in-law, she works at a grocery store, and I think she makes in around, $500, $600 a week, give or take, and she's actually, she wasn't born in this country, and so she's confused a lot of times why people are making all this, but she has a job, she's gone to it, but it's still somewhat difficult, I think, for people to look at their neighbor not going to work, making more money than the people that are going to work. So that's just a problem we have to deal with. And again, unfortunately, for folks that have work available, unemployment should not be available. Now, whether or not they're granted unemployment, I've heard varying things, but for the most part, it looks like they're being granted unemployment even when sometimes there's work available. I think ultimately we need to be vigilant as employers and respond accordingly to unemployment claims when there is work available, and then, appeal. And, that's just something you're going to have to do. One other issue that I've had come up with unemployment is where we've had partial unemployment, and with partial unemployment, you get the $600 a week. So when the employer moved to bring these people back full time, many of them did not want to come back full time because they were getting the $600 benefit again. And we kind of navigated that by, tweaking the schedule a bit and more of like operational things. And, this employer, and then you had employees who were full time that wanted to get the benefit. So there's all of these issues, and you just have to kind of work through them one at a time to do what's best for your business to keep operating. And it is difficult, but again, explaining to the worker, I think that, look, unemployment is not really available and then fighting the unemployment is kind of the only way to deal with that. Perhaps, with the individual that had the partial unemployment, we were able to work out coverage through operational solutions, and that helped. Those are things to think about as well. And then also, you just want to make sure, again, we're communicating return to work expectations, and then this $600 benefit is going to supposedly be up on July 31st, so we do have some more time to deal with it. Next slide, please. Now, I'm just going to go through this really quick. We need to review and update policies. So we need to look at our attendance policies. Again, we need to be flexible with attendance. Childcare, that's going to be an issue moving forward. Again, communicate, be flexible. You need to work with your employees to make sure that they can make it to work. Time off policies, dealing with PTO. And there's also things you can do with furloughs for exempt employees with PTO. Under the FLSA, you can't deduct wages for a single day vacation for an absence vacation by the employers, but you could potentially take away a PTO day or force them to use a PTO day. You'd have to change the policies there. You do want to take a look at it, make sure that your PTO policies is still consistent with what you can provide and want to provide. It might be more PTO to provide for 6 days, it might be less for vacation, those types of things. New policies to consider, all the things we've been talking about: social distancing, hand wash, temperature check, meetings and gatherings, how we're going to deal with those, and then just a general return to work policy after COVID-19, I think, is advisable. Next slide. Okay, so telework policies, we want to make sure potentially that we do. If we're going to allow telework, is it going to be a temporary or permanent policy? Remember, with the ADA, telework can be a reasonable accommodation, and many employers now have proven that it's not an undue burden on the employer, and that many jobs can be performed through telework. So if the individual does have a disability, it's probably going to be an option if they were teleworking prior to during COVID-19. So, but remember too, that you do not have to provide the accommodation that the employee requests. So if there's another accommodation that would alleviate the barrier to employment, you could provide that. But just something to think about. And again, we have the FFCRA leave provisions with the telework. If somebody can telework, do you have to provide them with the FFCRA leave? Things to think about. And again, I already talked about the ADA accommodation issue. But also, you want to, if you're going to have a telework option, and still you want to memorialize it within a policy so that you have, thought about these issues. You think about who's eligible, your work schedules, how is it approved? Are you going to provide equipment? And those types of things. And then also think about wage and hour issues for exempt and non-exempt employees working from home. You want to be able to account for hours worked for hourly employees. Next slide. Okay, and just real quick, some of the employment law risks, again, discrimination claims based on return to work selection. So who aren't you selecting? Who are you selecting? Be consistent. Think about, protected classes, female, male, those types of things, disabilities. One of the things that I've seen is that the employer wants to be paternalistic and keep high risk older employees from returning to work. That's a no-no. If, the employee is older and you have to treat them the same, even though they might be high risk. If they want to come back to work and you're having people come back to work, you can't discriminate against them on the basis of age, even though they're high risk. Discrimination based on policy application. So make sure we're administering the policies consistently. Again, we already talked about wage and hour claims. One area I've seen this is with the screening. We've had temperature taking in large employment places where it causes the employees to lose lunchtime. Pre and post work, we have good law there for the Fair Labor Standards Act. So the idea is that extra time where someone's waiting in line is that work time. Should an hourly employee be paid, and should they be paid overtime? So you want to think those things through, and that's where staggering comes into place. And also when somebody's leaving for lunch, I've seen there has been cases in different areas where that's been considered to be a violation, essentially. So pre and post work, typically going through these screening processes, and you're probably not going to be screening people post, but you might be screening people coming back in from lunch or otherwise. You want to be certainly careful, and even pre, I've advised clients where they can to make sure we're socially distancing and think about paying those individuals when they're sitting there, because you're going to have a lot of unhappy employees. And it could end up in litigation, regardless of whether you win. You don't want to be there. Retaliation claims. So I've had those already with the FFCRA. Terminations, and again, it has to do with performance management. If you are terminating somebody not for an FFCRA reason, make sure that that's all documented and you go through the proper procedures, and just be cognizant of the fact that when people are asking for leave or they're complaining about safety conditions, potentially there's a retaliation issue. With that, we'll go to the next slide, and I think Miriam and Teresa will kind of take over here.
Miriam, why don't you start, and then we can touch on the questions that have come through, please.
Sure. So, I mean, I think you can all see from just the topics we've talked about, everything that's happened will definitely have a long-term impact on the workplace. We've noted a couple things that we think employers should think about in particular. How you get employees to work, remote onboarding, remote work. Ryan talked about telework for a while. One thing I want to mention here is if you're thinking, well, I do want to keep my employees in the office when we come back or in the workplace, or I need them here. Think about your job descriptions, because it's important to kind of include in those job descriptions why on-site work is important. Certainly, we've seen this trend recently to open offices. Well, now, if you're, reading articles, what you're seeing is people are talking about going back to offices that are more enclosed and have more separations. There are lots of takeaways in terms of innovation for employers. How have we sped up the processes? How have we cut things out? So I think one thing we can't ignore is enhanced preparedness. Employers may have had preparedness plans before this, but I think we understand now that we need to dig deeper and think more broadly about those. And then we know, obviously continued workplace health and safety issues, and I would say personal privacy issues, right? To keep the workplace safe, we may need to understand additional information about who people are interacting with and medical issues. And, that butts up against privacy issues and rights that we all hold pretty dear to us. So I think these are just things we need to think about. It's great if you've had a team working on COVID issues, start them thinking on these issues to keep your workplace prepared. So I know Teresa has a couple questions for us. So,
and one you touched on, Miriam, was the medical privacy issue. One question, when you ask an employee why he or she can't comply, are you with the restrictions put in place, returning to work, etc., are you violating their privacy? Or does the employer have a higher right to privacy?
Right. So that's That's a great question, because everyone has this feeling that I don't have to disclose medical information. That's my private information, and it is. But once you've said to an employer, I can't do my job, then even the EOC has recognized that the employer does have some right to ask you some questions about why you can't do your job. So in some ways, it's if employee, you open the door by saying I can't work, and the employer has the ability to ask some questions. Now, you can't say give me all of your medical records, right? But you can say what is the condition that relates to your ability to do your job. You can say to the employee, give me some information from your healthcare provider. And then conversely, to protect those privacy rights, employers still have to keep that information confidential.
Okay, thank you. And Ryan, I think this one is for you because you spoke about childcare. What do you do if the employee's childcare provider, the babysitter, is concerned about coming to the house to provide babysitting services? Would that be a legitimate reason under childcare issues for a person to say, I can't return to work?
That's a good question. So, under the FFCRA, actually, that individual, if they don't have the necessary childcare, they would actually be eligible for the paid sick leave and then the family medical leave more likely than not if they don't have another avenue to provide health care for their child. So that's definitely a reason. So we might, if especially a larger employer, we want to think about potentially arranging that for our employees at this point. It might be something that we need to do necessarily to continue our operations. Depending upon what occurs in the coming months, with schools. And I think at least in a lot of, we're seeing it open up a little bit more, but we don't know. And that goes to Miriam's discussion regarding preparedness. These are things we need to be thinking about, is how are we going to deal with, child care issues moving forward if there's another outbreak and, a spike, I guess I will call it, and
Ryan,
things get closed down again.
And Ryan, as an employer, am I allowed to ask for documentation from that employee demonstrating that they don't have child care?
Yeah, and there's no form that I'm aware of yet, but I created one that I've given to clients that, if somebody wants to email me, I'd be happy to share with them. That it basically gives them the, a form to fill out. And the reason why it's so important to get that information as well, and you might want to get a note from the child care provider along with this form filled out by the employee, is because if you are giving them benefits under the FFCRA, then you're going to need some documentation to get that tax credit on your quarterly. So it's very, very important to have the documentation. So thanks for pointing that out. Yeah.
Okay, and I have one final question because I believe the others have been addressed through the presentation, but I think this is important, even if it's been addressed, to go over it. What is the process if an employee does contract the virus? What do we do if they've been away, say it's a Monday and they report they got tested, they do have the virus? What does the employer do?
Miriam, I can handle it, or if you'd like to, I know that was your slide through the
Sure.
presentation.
So, yeah. I mean, I think we both can have input, but so let's say employee feels sick over the weekend, says they can't report on Monday. The first thing we want, obviously, we want to have made clear that employees who feel sick should not be reporting to work. They should call whoever you've designated, HR or their supervisor. We want to encourage them to contact their healthcare provider, hopefully get a test. And then, so there are a couple options here, right? They get a test. They're going to be self-isolating until we get the test results. Kind of two divergent paths here. If they, if they get a test then, and they test positive, then we're going to follow the guidance from the healthcare provider. That is typically 3 days after, you have to stay out while you have symptoms, 3 days or 72 hours after those symptoms have resolved, or at least 10 days since the first symptoms have appeared.
Okay, thank you.
Let me just point out one other thing. I mean, there's still an issue of someone who calls and says that they've had an exposure and they don't know. And what the CDC is still recommending in that case is 14 days out. So, let me just kind of bring it back to, this is a good reason to develop some scenarios so that you're prepared for, okay, you've tested positive, what will we do? You've had an exposure, what will we do? And you could, there are lots and lots of permutations, so it's a good thing to be prepared.
And I think this is a good, just to add on there real quick, I think it's good to have this potentially even in the policy, because it demonstrates our preparedness to our employees, and this kind of piggybacks with some of the other information and the communication that we talked about. It lets the employees know what we're doing if someone is infected, how we're treating that, and it lets them know what to do. And like Miriam said, I think it's so obvious, but hey, if you're sick, don't come to work. I mean, it used to be that was a pretty big issue where we'd have sick people coming to work because, it wasn't to put quote unquote life and death. But now hopefully that's known, but I think we still need to say it.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And there is a clarification on the child care issue, the babysitter coming into the house. And Ryan, I think your position will be the same, but it's the child, the 10-year-old child who is anxious about the grandparents who are the babysitters coming to the house to babysit. So as you know, the grandparents will be in an older age group, and it's the child who's concerned. Would the treatment still be the same with respect to the employee?
So, yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, whatever the reason, I would say in that situation, I think it's arguable whether childcare is available, and then, you would need to kind of, certainly, it's the parent's decision ultimately, whether they want to respect the wishes of a child. In many instances, a child wants things or, that the parents don't give them, right? But I think ultimately, if there's not a suitable child care person, and the parent has to be the child care, they have to care for the child, I think it's the same answer. I think they would still be entitled to, I think you can make the argument. I really wouldn't want to make the argument, I don't think that's a good argument to make. I think the better, more reasons, and you don't want to get into that kind of, value. Is that grandparent really available to provide child care because the child won't accept it,
Right.
I mean, I would just say, look, there's no child care available, so I'm going to just proceed as if there's no child care available.
Child care available, right. And the parent needs to work from home. Okay, and I'm enjoying that we still have questions. Another one just came in. And the question is, how do you compensate an employee who has been in contact with a COVID-19 positive household member who must now stay home and quarantine? And this is from a small business owner with less than 15 FTEs, and they're exempt from FFRCA and FMLA.
So, right. Well,
so someone in their household has Go ahead.
Yeah. Miriam. Well, they want to make, they have to establish that they're exempt from the Families First Act, but let's assume that that's the basis for the question, so we'll assume that. So, there are a couple options. If employee has accrued time, maybe vacation time, sick time, the employer would could use that. But if the employee needs to, if you've determined that there's an exposure and the employee needs to self-quarantine, then it may be that this is unpaid. Now, we know that there's an expansion of unemployment benefits and the need to either self-quarantine or care for a family member may be a basis to get unemployment benefits depending on how long you need to be out. So it might be that the employee gets unemployment benefits. In normal circumstances, being out for those reasons would not qualify the employee for unemployment. So, so your own benefit pool or potentially unemployment.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's it for the questions that have come through. I'd just like to thank everyone for their time today, especially and staying online. That when we went over a lot of helpful information, I hope for all. And on behalf of McDonald Hopkins, my teammates, Miriam and Ryan, and our fabulous marketing team, we say thank you. And Erica, do you have any closing remarks on behalf of the President's Council?
I just want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Thank you, McDonald Hopkins, for being an extraordinary partner for the President's Council. And we encourage all participants to reach out to the President's Council. We are here to serve any small business, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.